There we go. Hey,
Hey there, how are you?
there he is.
Actually
David.
figured out how to use this technology over the last 6 months.
I know. We were just talking about that. Like it's turning us all into these, the thing that we thought was silly, watching young kids always on their computers, and here we are, always on our computers. So it's gone around. It's gone full circle.
How are you?
Really good.
Good.
Yeah, it's the first time from my point of view. Uh, it's been half a year, 6 months since the last performance, and actually the group being together, the Canadian
Yeah.
Brass. So it's a remarkable change. I don't think in our 50-year history we ever had more than a couple weeks free. It was hard to even declare a holiday, and now
Right.
suddenly half a year. So we can talk about that. We'll be talking about Arnold Jacobs later, but the the best lesson I ever had, and I think I mentioned this to Jarrett before. Um, Arnold said, not to worry about, how trumpet players can't take a walk up a mountain because they're afraid to leave their mouthpiece behind for 10 hours. And Mr. Jacobs said, you can leave your horn for a month, pick it up. It'll be exactly the way you left it, except for endurance.
Yes.
So I'm counting on that. Fortunately, that was planted in the back of my brain early enough that I believe it. So I think if you believe it, it's true.
Well, I mean,
Well,
Chuck, you go ahead. Sorry.
I can tell you this, that after taking 5 years off or 4 years off and bringing a tuba down with me to our house here in South Carolina and practicing every single day for about 4 months, maybe a month, but not 4 years.
4 years. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. So far,
Yes.
so good. But actually, we're playing more, and I was telling the guys, and maybe you're finding this too, because of the time free and not having to travel and head out to airports. I've always got an instrument right next to me
Yeah.
on the desk, and you just pick it up and play. I think I've been playing more now than ever since I was a student, perhaps playing more on my own.
Yes.
Yeah. So that might be similar for you. Are you actually performing a fair bit? Well, I guess it's the same thing. We've had this 6 month hiatus, but other than that,
No. When I left playing, when I retired from the symphony in September 2014, I made the decision I would no longer take any kind of playing jobs. I was used, people would call me up and say, in fact, my first job offer was with Swiss Romand when they were here in the States. And I asked them what they were playing, and I said, no, that's okay. I said, I'm not practicing 3 hours a day. You should pay someone who does, because I'd always practiced a lot. And
nice.
so I wasn't practicing, and I didn't want to. I'd seen people come back that once they're out of the daily routine, come back and play like with the orchestra, and it wasn't what it had been, and I didn't want to do that.
Mhm.
So that was my personal decision. It certainly shouldn't be everyone's. My wife Sally studied with Leonard Falcone on euphonium at Michigan State
Mhm.
for her grad work, and so she's talked about getting, maybe once things get going with the Queen City Brass Band down here in Charlotte area, we would start doing some playing again, but we'll see.
Nice. Well, I think that's one of the important things that both sides of that. One is as a professional carrying on, and maybe not at the same level that you played. It's difficult, like someone like me, if I heard you play in the Baltimore Symphony, that's David Fedderly, and now suddenly you're playing with say, an amateur group or something, and it's going to be a different experience for a listener and for you. It's just not going to be the same.
No, it wouldn't be the same. That
Yeah,
from me.
yeah, yeah. Right, right. You had a remarkable orchestral history. You're Midwestern, so I we weren't too far apart. I know you're
No,
much younger than I am, but uh,
I have
uh,
more mileage.
Don't we all?
I had a lot of relatives through that same area, the Minneapolis, that whole band
Yes.
across there, the Scandinavian band of North America. And I actually spent a couple weeks at the Bemidji Music Festival, and I
Hmm.
understand you were there too. But I was in sixth grade, so I have a hunch when I was in sixth grade, you were probably only in, gosh, maybe fifth.
Well, I was born in 1953, so
Okay, so we're a
But
few years apart. Yeah, so you would have
yes,
been, and it was the same thing. When I was there, Jaroslav Chimera was the
okay,
coach,
yeah,
the
yeah,
trombonist. Then he was the famous trombone player from the band era. These
hmm
guys that could play anything all over the horn, rapid, fast, and his thing was crash tones, where you just play as loud as you could, just bang in on the note just as loud as you could with all the air you possibly could. And it was actually pretty good training for use of air, because
hmm
you weren't setting, you weren't getting ready, you weren't doing all these things that somehow you start classical training and it all closes down. So you grew up in Minneapolis, so I guess you heard the Minneapolis Orchestra a lot.
No, I
Or
actually
did you?
grew up north of Duluth.
Oh wow, that's way up there.
Um, yeah, I'm from almost to Canada.
Uh-huh.
The other side of Minnesota from Winnipeg there, Jarrett. Um, but on Lake Superior. So I was born in Duluth and I grew up there. Now I spent a lot of time in Minneapolis and I had family in Minneapolis. And I knew Paul Walton and I did do the Minnesota high school project.
Hmm.
And so that's when I met Ross Tolbert for the first time. And of course, knew Paul Walton, bought my first tuba at Growth Music through Paul Walton, who had been in the Minnesota Orchestra before
Oh.
Toby Hanks and then Ross Tolbert
Right.
for a couple of
So
years. So,
did you
but
bump
so I
into
heard the orchestra.
yeah, did you bump into Toby? Did you get any time with Toby?
No, that was before my time when I was down
Okay.
there. Also,
Yeah.
I mean, I saw Toby. He would he would be on the going back up to New York from Peabody, and I might be going up to Juilliard to teach. It
Oh,
was
okay. So you
we were kind
okay.
of going back, and he was going down to Baltimore. I was going
Yeah.
up to New York, and so I would see him, and we got to know each other later on, but
Hmm.
not during
Hmm.
that time when I was in high school.
Well, Toby had a big effect on me sound wise. I always thought he was a little more refined player. He was a little more confined, maybe a little smaller player. He wasn't like the huge
Right.
orchestral kind of player. And I always felt that if I was playing well at every given moment, I was closer to Toby than anyone. Um, he had a really nice style and approach to the instrument. So you met Mr. Jacobs early on, apparently. Is this true? Were you probably just
No. So what happened was I'm at Bemidji Music Camp, and at the time, David McCormick, who's having his 90th birthday party coming up, um, was the tuba teacher. And David had studied with Mr. Jacobs, and uh,
Hmm.
John Painter, who was director of bands at Northwestern, was the conductor of bands, and Mr. Bainham was up there with him, who had been the previous band director there, and Fred Hemke, who was the head of winds and brass at Northwestern. And Paul Walton, who'd been in the Minnesota Orchestra, he and Steve Zelmer only lived a couple of houses down from Mr. Jacobs. And Paul was from Peoria, came up as a kid, ended up in the Minnesota Orchestra. And Paul Walton, David McCormick were all saying, you have to go study with Arnold Jacobs. You should be down in Chicago studying with Arnold Jacobs. I'm some little kid from a hick town in northern Minnesota in the sticks, you know. Okay, I got to study with this guy. All right. And Paul Walton was the teacher at in University of Minnesota, and he said, I'd love you to come to Minnesota, but you need to go study with Arnold Jacobs. So I thought, okay. So what ended up happening is we were playing scenes from the Louvre in the band with Painter conducting, and I was first tuba. And he stops and he says, "First tuba, can you play that first page down an octave?" So I did. I was in high school and played it down. He stops the band, 100 and some kids. He goes, "Tuba player doesn't realize it, but he just took his audition for Northwestern and got in." And so the first time I stepped foot on Northwestern was to unload the car to bring my stuff into the dorm to Orrington Apartments. And then I found out who this Mr. Jacobs guy was, and I was scared to
Oh,
death at my
oh,
first
no kidding.
lessons.
No kidding. So
I
they
had
didn't
heard a couple recordings, but didn't
uh-huh.
know him.
So they didn't check your grade point average or anything?
Well,
Northwestern, that's tough to get in.
it was good enough.
Oh, good.
It wasn't too bad.
I mean, that's a real deal. You go to Northwestern for music and you have to study other things. Jarrett and I were talking about this earlier. Jarrett went to the University of Michigan, and suddenly you
Okay.
have to do other things like math or psychology or crazy things, right, Jarrett? You had
Yeah, exactly. So talk about your first interaction with Mr. Jacobs, because people talk about him just having this like larger than life personality and just the voice. Yeah. I've never met him, but I can just almost hear his voice in my head. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Sure. Well, Chuck knows this, that because probably when you started studying with him, he was still in his house, right, Chuck?
Yep.
Yeah. And so, yeah. So the Northwestern was about 80 blocks north of the Loop, and his house was at 8839 South Normal. So it was a long way. You could not take a train because it was a very dangerous area that he lived in at the time. And so you had to ride with an upperclassman, but we would take lessons. And you go in the basement. And one of the first thing he does is he decides he's going to check my vital capacity. And he's got a 5-liter water ballast where when you blow, it blows this canister out of the water. And I started blowing, and it started coming out of the out of the pot that it was in. He stop. And he says, "Oh, you probably got at least 6." And I had 7,400 milliliters.
Wow.
And 7.4 liters. And he says to me, "Oh, you've got twice as much as I have." And then he stopped and he looked at me and he says, "But I still play better than you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here."
Perfect.
And one of the first lessons, I'm shaking like a leaf in his basement. I'm scared. I'm just, I found out who this person was and all of this stuff, and I'm sweating. And he looks at me and says, "Oh, is it warm in here?" So a typical Mr. Jacobs way of kind of letting you know that he knew.
Nice.
He had ways of a couple of words just kind of making you go.
Well, it's too bad iPhones weren't around back then. I wish we had pictures of all that. The whole experience of going to his house, the neighborhood was already interesting. And then the walk up to the door, and Gizzy, his wife, would usually answer. She was a former ballerina.
Yes.
She'd answer the door, and the first thing you'd notice is that there was 24-hour-a-day news in every room in the house, quite loud.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd try to get down the stairs, and there's somebody in that house was a hoarder, because they had magazines and books. You could barely. I think if you had a large bell tuba, you'd have to put it in through a window or something.
Exactly.
Going down to the basement, and then you got in his studio, and it was a fully operational, very mechanized. He had all the equipment and stuff and the instruments sitting around. Suddenly, you were in a different world. But it was until that moment you walked in, you're in a real basement until you walk through that door, and then his studio was.
Well, my thing was, of course, somebody had to sit upstairs during the other person's lesson, and Mrs. Jacobs' mother, Mrs. Velfie, was still alive. And they had, it wasn't Schweppes anymore. It was Trouble was the dog. And yeah, it was I don't know if you remember, probably didn't see it, but talking about hoarding, there was a big console TV sitting on the corner in the living room. And then above it, there was a little smaller TV because the console wasn't working anymore. And then above it, there was another one because the one below it stopped, and there was a fourth TV.
Oh my God.
And there were 3 sets of washing machines down in the basement. And actually, Paul Walton is the one who helped dig out that studio. And Paul's father was a contractor. Paul actually plastered the walls. That was a dugout underneath that his studio was in, was a dugout underneath the porch.
Oh, no kidding. Well, that explains
how low it was and all that.
I think I was there once when he had just finished bailing it out. There'd been a rainstorm and the water had come up. Yeah, that's the other side of the Mr. Jacobs. So you think of him as
yes, there.
The white tie and tails and walking on the Chicago Orchestra stage is one Mr. Jacobs, and the other is the South Chicago experience, which was quite unique.
Yes,
but he was obviously a very strong influence on you, and I'm thinking of 2 things. One is that he trusted his orchestra in your hands many times. You got to play in the Chicago Orchestra in his stead. That was this is pretty well known. You know, word travels fast in the music world, and of course, when you started playing there, everybody, oh, Dave Fedder's been playing in the Chicago Symphony. Maybe he'll be maybe he'll be the next tuba player. Not realizing that Mr. Jacobs was going to stay there until he was 80 something, right?
Which I was glad of. And yeah, I was very, very lucky. Mr. Jacobs generally didn't have anybody in Civic that was in Northwestern or in school. He tried to help out the players that were in town trying to study with him that weren't in school any longer, couldn't play. So I actually won my first summer out of school. Jimmy Gilbertson was the adjudicator and behind the screen, and I did get that summer. And then I was in for several more years, and very lucky, got to play extra. Did Belshazzar's Feast with them the first time. And then I got some, very lucky for me, in the summers that Mr. Jacobs would take 3 or 4 weeks off of Ravinia because it was so far for him to go. And I would get to do those, which financially was a huge thing also for me during the summer because I was doing so much private teaching. But yeah, he was a huge influence, a mentor, just
right,
all of that. And one thing I did, and I don't know that other people did this, I would leave my lesson. Of course, you had an hour before you got home because you were either in a car or later on when you moved downtown, you might be on the train. And I would think about what was he working on in my playing today? And what exercises was he assigning me and making me play them in certain ways to accomplish what he was trying to do? Because there was talk about the mechanics with me, tongue position, throat position, all of this stuff. But the biggest change, I remember saying to him one time, "Are you changing my embouchure?" And he said, "Why do you ask?" And I said, "Because I can't hit the broadside of a barn." He said, "Oh, you noticed." But it was through musical means that he did it.
Yeah.
And so and his thing was the embouchure is a variable on every single note. So what's the big deal if we change the embouchure? So obviously huge influence, great respect for him, a great relationship even after I was in St. Louis. The 1 year before Gene got the job in St. Louis, there was a 1 year opening, and I was on the phone with him constantly. And then after that, and I would go occasionally and take lessons, even right until the time of his passing.
Did you know, I don't know if you share this experience, but I liked calling him several times to make sure the lesson was in place. And the reason I was calling is not so much to know if the lesson was still on, but to hear his voice. His voice alone was a lesson. It had that deep, very resonant. And then I found someone, oddly, you kind of look for this, but some very good mentors and friends of ours. There's a Pakin family in Hamilton, and Marnie Pakin, his father, had that same voice, that very resonant, beautiful voice. And I would make a point several times. I tried to call when I knew they were there just to hear him answer the phone, because it had that. It was almost like a lesson. You heard that resonance. You say, "Well, that's what I want to sound like." You know, my voice is way up here, and these guys are, like beautiful, rich, resonant. Yeah, right on there. Yeah. So Jarrett and you, David, shared the Civic. Different.
Okay.
But
different.
Jarrett,
yeah, I'm in it right now. I was going to ask you a question, sort of. So I've played a couple times with CSO this year, just as like an extra, sort of like you were.
Congratulations, great.
And we did this sort of right before everything locked down. Well, a little bit before. It was in January. You know, things were sort of, the lockdown was sort of very far off in the horizon.
Yes.
We did some pieces by Michael Tippett. And one of them is this like preludium for bells, brass, and percussion. I'm not sure if you've played it. It's like a really weird, like 7-minute, like quirky piece. Brass ensemble. And I was playing second tuba. You know, I'd heard from a couple people that when you play with CSO for the first time, it's obviously this like crazy experience. Everyone's a great musician. But the thing that shocked me the most is the low end of dynamic that those musicians can play at. Like, it's just so quiet. And some of the most tender, quiet moments, I was like barely playing. And I was like, how is this possible? But then you listen back to the recording and it's so present and it's distant. And just that level of sort of awareness of, you know, the space and like what everyone else is playing. I'm just wondering if you can kind of talk about sort of your revelations when you were playing with the group for the first time as a civic musician? Because for me, it was, I was realizing things that I didn't know that I would realize.
Well, I think you played with a very different orchestra from what I played with. And I do know that Schilke used to say, woodwinds make a miracle, brass safe soft. And so I don't think that really soft end you're talking about was so present at the time when I was playing. Where I first ran into that was in St. Louis. I will say that by the time I came back, as part of the audition procedure, they had each of us come in and play a concert at Ravinia. And I did Tchaikovsky 6. And I can tell you, probably the only person that heard the soft notes in the chorale. So this is, what was it, 87, 80, whatever, the 80s when that audition was taking place. I think the only person that probably heard the really soft notes of the chorale in the last movement of Tchaikovsky 6 was Dale Clevenger right in front of us, because it was incredibly soft. And of course could be still incredibly loud, but it was a different orchestra at that point. When I was there, it was Ed Kleinhammer and Frank Crisafulli. Of course, Jay was still there, Jay Friedman, and Jim was there. It was a very different orchestra from what you played with. And there's that, I think you're absolutely right, there's that lower end. My biggest surprise was I was playing Planets, maybe the first time I played by myself with the orchestra. And the first entrance in that first movement is Mezzo Forte. And I was playing as loud as I could to keep up with them. I thought, I got 3 Fs at the bottom of this page. What am I going to do?
Yeah, that was shocking too. I mean, where I was sitting right next to Dan Gingrich, the principal horn.
Yeah. I know Danny.
That for me was shocking too, just like hearing his, like how low he could go, and just sort of being in that soundscape instead of being in the back. And that was sort of really eye-opening for me. It was just, I mean, obviously the money's great to like play with them for a week, but for me the real treat was just to hear these guys like right sort of next door, because it's so much different than hearing them in the audience. So that's a real like gift as a civic musician, I think.
Yes. Were you surprised at what they sounded like up close?
Yeah, honestly, like,
it wasn't as wonderful, was it?
Yeah, but you listen back to the recording and it's awesome. It's just, I think that's knowing the people you're playing with, knowing the space, knowing so much about, I mean, just playing there every day and every week.
There was an interesting moment when trumpet players were trying these. It's a different trumpet, a very heavy trumpet apparently, and Mr. Hersov in the Chicago Symphony was playing this trumpet, and they said, well, the amazing thing about this particular horn is at the very back of the hall, it sounds just like it does on stage. And people said, well, yes, but that may be a problem. Perhaps you want to go back to your fantastic Bach trumpet, because it develops a different sound as it goes, through the hall and so forth.
Well, I know what trumpet you're talking about, and what shocked me when I first heard it, and I finally understood when I went behind the player, because it is a huge dark sound behind the player, behind the bell. Quite different, I think, quite different in front of the bell. And all instruments are, we all deal with that, and I teach that. But in Mr. Jacobs, it's a funny story. I was playing B flat, of course, as you know, because I actually met you over at Schilke's in the 70s. But
you
Mr. Jacobs
in the 70s. Oh my gosh.
No, but you guys were really hitting. I mean, you were really coming on strong. I mean, it was a big deal to get to meet you, and the whole group was there at the time. Remind me to tell you about your tuba one time. But Mr. Jacobs was he was talking about articulation, and he said, "Give me your horn." I had a Zeiss B flat, it's like, okay. And he played it, and he says, "There, you hear it?" I go, "Oh yeah, I think I know what you want." So I play, he goes, "No, give me your horn." So I gave it back, and I thought I heard what he sounded like more in the articulation. And so I took the horn back, and I played. He goes, "No, give me the horn." He said, "Imitate that." And I thought, he really doesn't sound very good. He really sounds kind of bad. And so I thought, I'm a little hot-headed then, and I thought, fine, I'll show you exactly what you sound like. And I played with this, what I thought was a horrible sound. And it got very quiet in the studio. And I thought, uh-oh, I've done it again. I've stepped over the line. And all of a sudden his hand touched my leg, as he always did. And he says, "That's it." And I thought, wait a minute, I just played really crappy, but I know he likes me. And so I went back to Northwestern and I said, "Rich, listen to this." He said, "Oh yeah, that way's much better." I'm going, wait a minute, it sounds horrible to me. So it was really that learning curve. And I talk to students, the sound we have to hear under the bell or behind the bell, so that it's the right sound out in the audience.
You know, I find that with trombone players a lot. They spend their whole life trying to go from a B flat to a sixth position C with and sound do 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 do, and they get softer in the legato tonguing, and they're worrying about articulation. And then you hear them in some like regional orchestra and so forth. You'll hear the trombones; it just sounds like a slurry mess because they don't realize by the time it gets to the audience, that articulation would be just fine. Thank you very much. You don't have to be that buttery. But that is it's true. And that's why you need mentors and one of the things that we musicians should learn from opera singers and actors is they tend to have coaches their entire career. We take our final lesson in high school or our final lesson in college or our final lesson for a job, and that's it. You're gone. And I think that's something that Mr. Jacobs, to all of us, it was somebody we could go to anytime. You didn't have to set out 10 lessons. You could say, 3 years ago I had a lesson, I got to get back there, and it was fine. One-off lessons were amazing with him as a mentor. Yeah.
My first lesson, one of the very first lessons, if you remember, he had a telephone in his basement on the wall. Phone rings, he answers, and he's talking to somebody about high trumpet playing. And, of course, I'm just finding out who this guy is that I'm sitting here studying with, right? Hangs up the phone. He says, "Oh, that was Lou Soloff from Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He's talking about piccolo trumpets." And I'm going, "Oh, man, this is just what I needed."
Oh, that's fun. Well, the other thing that used to come through on that phone call, never for me, I was there, but I heard it happen. Somebody would call and they'd say, he says, "Oh, yeah, that was the X Symphony. They needed a tuba player. So I just recommended a fine student of mine." I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. It's just, by a phone call, somebody was suddenly in a major symphony. I thought that's a nice contact to have.
Yes, things were very different back then.
Yeah, indeed.
I was thinking about a question that pertains to that. So obviously, Arnold Jacobs' influence is pervasive right now. And you think about his most famous students and they're sort of everywhere. But today, obviously there's very famous teachers, but it seems like, somebody wins a job who's Perantoni student, somebody wins a job who's Fedderly student, somebody wins a job who's Kensig student. At the time, was everybody who was getting a job a Jacobs student, or was it sort of more like his students are more do you understand the question that I'm asking? Is his influence more pervasive now, or was it still pervasive at the time?
I don't know what Chuck would say, but I think that what we have to do, and my wife keeps saying that Mike Lynch and I need to do this, and obviously Chuck would be involved. I think that most of it leads back to Bill Bell, Arnold Jacobs, Harvey Phillips. And most of them, like for Mr. Jacobs, now he studied with Mr. Donatelli at Curtis, but his biggest influence was actually Tabito, I think. If you study Tabito's writings and things, you'll discover that a lot of Mr. Jacobs' teaching is very close to what Tabito taught, because everybody at Curtis had to take this musicianship class with Tabito, no matter what instrument you played. I think Mr. Bell studied with the trombone player, if I remember right. Chimera, I think, was the tuba teacher at Northwestern when David McCormick was there. So I think we kind of all go back to those roots of those three, and maybe August Helleberg, and then you kind of begin to branch out the tree. I think we have to start at the base of the tree to find that out. I think that at least when I was around, everyone studied with Mr. Jacobs. I mean, I saw every major player come through there. I mean, the people that you see, and they might say I was an Arnold Jacobs student. What I like is, like Gene Pokorny talks about having taken a few lessons from Mr. Jacobs, which is what I like. People who take one lesson or two lessons from me, or maybe from Chuck or somebody, and then say, I studied with Chuck Dallenbach. Well, two lessons doesn't make you a student of that person. But Gene will talk about how Jeff Reynolds and Tommy Johnson and Roger were his teachers. And I think that that's true. It's to know, to know that Roger did some work with Arnold Jacobs, and Dan Perantoni did, but Toby did. There are very few people who didn't. But there weren't a lot of people that started with Mr. Jacobs, kind of like what I did, and ended up getting jobs. It was people who already had jobs or were very advanced players, were constantly in there.
Well, he was like a psychologist. I mean, or even a psychiatrist. A lot of players that were having problems would sneak in. He liked to tell you that he had people sneaking in. Don't tell anybody I was here because I have a principal trumpet job somewhere, and I don't want anybody to know I'm having problems. But he was the problem solver. I don't want to embarrass you totally, David, but I was telling Jarrett earlier, I've always felt, from my point of view, and I met Mr. Jacobs when I was still in high school, which was very, very fortunate. But of all the people that I've met, and I've heard them talking and teaching and what they do and so forth, I've always felt that you were the one that carried the message most directly and unfettered, close to Fedderly, but unfettered. I know that when I would recommend, it was easy in the early years that I would recommend people, same thing, go down and see Mr. Jacobs. That was always a recommendation. Well, there came a point when that was no longer possible. And I had to think about, well, who would be my recommendation then at that point? And you're it. You're the guy I always felt carried that message. Because one thing Mr. Jacobs did not do is he never approached problems on the level of the problem. He never let somebody come in and tell him he had a problem and then he'd work on that problem. He just would take you right past that. And I felt that you had that same, you were there to talk about music and song and approach, and you weren't going to labor somebody with, here, try this mouthpiece. Well, try this. Maybe the problem is this. The problem could be this. And pretty soon somebody walks out, they can't play anymore.
Well, I tell my students that the biggest thing is, and at this point, I was working with a trio with a plastic surgeon, physical therapist, and myself, helping injured players from literally all over the world. That's kind of stopped. The physical therapist has quit practicing, and the plastic surgeon is no longer doing micro tear surgeries or tearing lip surgeries. I always tell my students that what I have to do when you go in and you talk to your doctor and you start saying this hurts and this is a problem and I'm having this problem, I'm having this problem, the doctor is not going to react to your symptoms, which is what those really are, or my embouchure feels really weak. What's the source of that? And it could be the embouchure is weak, so I'm not going to ignore that, but there's usually a source that's making the embouchure feel that way. Sometimes it's air. A lot of times with older players, when I see them, and like Mr. Jacobs, I never talk about who comes in. There's someone that you sent to me years and years ago who tells everybody that he studied with me for 9 years or whatever. So that's fine. But I never talk about people because I do see some people who don't want people to know. Many of the cases in older players, it's just they're not taking much air in. Their vital capacities are going down and they're feeling the tongues coming up, throat's closing, I'm having trouble articulating. And as soon as you start telling me all those symptoms, it goes back to, here's your problem, let me see if this is what it is. And so it's really finding the source, not the symptom. I tell students, like if somebody comes in and say they're in their 50s and they say, Doc, I'm exercising the same amount and I'm eating the same amount, but I'm gaining weight. A bad doctor will say, well, you're getting older, metabolism's slowing down. Or someone will say, I'm exercising the same and I'm losing weight. and eating the same amount of money, but well, you know, evidently your metabolism is sped up because you're working out. Well, in the one case, you're going to keep gaining weight because your thyroid is bad because they didn't check your blood work. And in the other case, you're probably not going to be alive because it's probably cancer that's causing the loss of weight. And so that's what I always say. We have to, as teachers, not listen to the symptoms, but figure out what's causing the symptoms that the person is talking about, rather than the symptoms themselves. Students that have articulation issues, teachers start assigning them all sorts of articulation studies, and it just gets worse, because the problem is they have a tongue that kind of goes backwards, and when they say TOH, toe, everything gets blocked, and you just change them to TOE, toe, like I had to, and the tongue goes forward where it needs to be. So it's a very small thing like that, which can cause major disruption, and it's just a congenital heart or congenital tongue situation, tongue muscle.
Wow. That's really interesting. I'm wondering, sort of hearing you talk about all this, at what point, so where do you think that when you teach, you are emulating Mr. Jacobs' teaching, or do you think it's your own teaching mixed with Mr. Jacobs, or do you think it's your own, or how do you view your allegiance to Mr. Jacobs at this point in your career?
Well, I always tell people I studied with him, that I learned a tremendous amount. I asked which books I should be looking at and reading. I was, to a much lesser extent, what Brian Fredrickson did after I left town was what I was doing beforehand, at master classes, seeing Mr. Jacobs' work. And I went to a lot of the master classes at Northwestern and would watch and think, okay, he's going to pick up this. He's going to pick up the Voldine. He's going to pick up the Inspiron. He's going to bring in the pressure gauge and began to do that. All I can tell you is, years ago, I used to give 3 lectures at the National Orchestra Institute on respiratory function. And Manny Laureano was there, and principal trumpet of Minnesota. And Manny said, it's so great to hear all of the Jacobs stuff, but he said, there's a lot of your stuff in there. And I said, I know that the biggest part came from Mr. Jacobs, and I don't know what's mine from having to figure out how to do my own playing and get from what he was saying and all of that. So I know it's a mixture, but I also know that the heart of it comes from Mr. Jacobs' way of thinking and teaching. And when I was in Chicago, it was wind and song. And in fact, when I saw the original diskette from the book, I said, Brian, at least get the title right. It's wind and song. He said, no, he changed it because people thought that the wind was the important part. I said, no. The song is the important part, and that's what controls the wind once we have the air in. He said, exactly. So he changed it. So that was a huge influence for me as a player and obviously as a teacher.
Tell our viewers here what he changed it to, from wind and song to
song and wind.
Song and wind. Exactly. And that was a major, yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about Baltimore, because I mean, we talked a bit about this when we were talking about this, setting this up, but I played Barber's First Symphony a couple years ago, and I forget what recording I was listening to, but then one of the trumpet players in the orchestra, he was like, you got to hear Zinman Baltimore. You got to listen to Zinman Baltimore. And I remember the first time I listened to it, I was like, wow, that tuba playing is amazing. So I'd love to hear you talk about Baltimore and those recordings and all that.
Well, we were very lucky. David Zinman was a great musician, very cerebral in a lot of ways, very, very smart, spent tremendous amounts of time in the mastering of the recordings also. So he was really into that. The Barber recording was on Nonesuch, if I remember right, possibly. And that was actually David's son was the engineer on that recording. And yes, it's very flattering. It's a very flattering recording. But we didn't realize it because David was pushing us so hard, and we were doing so much touring and so much recording that it truly was the golden age of the Baltimore Symphony back then. But he was always, okay, that was a great concert, but we've got to do this, and we have to, next week we're in London and we have to make sure this is good because this critic is, and so we were always looking forward. And it wasn't until later we all went, wow, that was really an amazing time. It was an amazing time of the players. It was just that that right moment in an orchestra's time where everything just kind of gels. There was enough older players, enough younger players, a music director. The money was there for recording and tours. It's not all the orchestras like the Chicago Symphony that used to tour twice a year, domestically and foreign almost every year. Mr. Jacobs would say, "We're going to be in Europe for 4 weeks. Call me in 5 weeks for the next lesson."
Yeah, it's really fascinating because a city like Baltimore, it's like one of those cities that like could have a fantastic orchestra, but also could have a smaller orchestra. So is it kind of around that time that you think that Baltimore sort of became one of those real kind of amazing domestic orchestras, or do you think that came later or before, or when do you think that was?
It started changing when Sergio Commissiona took over the orchestra. It was really from what I understand, it was a community orchestra back then. Now, he's who hired me, but that was his last year. In 1982, the Meyerhoff Symphony Hall was built, and they opened the first concerts. That was Commissiona's last year, and David Zinman came in after that. 82, the year before I went there in 83, was the first 52-week season for the Baltimore Symphony. And it was 52 weeks with a few years of a couple of furlough weeks here and there, until this last year when they went down to 40 weeks. Mm-hmm. And I think they're going to less probably when they do reopen. Wow. So I think there was that time period from 83 until 2018, 2019.
So, Canadian Brass, we had an interesting moment with the Baltimore Orchestra, and I wondered if you were aware of this moment. Canadian Brass, we were always we were brought in to stand in front of orchestras and pops concerts. Mm-hmm. The repertoire didn't really sustain like a Series A, what you say, a 20-minute Brahms piano concerto. We didn't have a brass piece of that quality, so we were doing pops concerts. And Lucas Foss, one of the group of many that include Bernstein and Barber and those mm-hmm. people, Lucas Foss wrote a piece for us called Night Music, a really wonderful piece. He wrote it in memory of John Lennon, not quoting Beatles, but the emotion of the moment. Mm-hmm. Lucas had lived right on Fifth, right across from the park where all the vigils were taking place. So he was very affected by the John Lennon murder. So he wrote this piece for us, Night Music, and we brought it to the Baltimore Orchestra. And we just thought it was a sensational piece. There's a moment at the end where the strings are working furiously and they're working, but they're coming off the strings. They're told in the music to gradually come away. So you see the orchestra, you hear it, and the music starts drifting away. It goes away, goes away, and goes away, and goes away, but they're still working equally hard, and then it ends with a big anvil shot. Well, we did it with the orchestra, and it seemed to go well, but we didn't play with the orchestra for several years after that because the conductor complained. He said, "This is a pops concert." He said, "We had to rehearse that piece. It had 3 8-bar mixed meters, and you can't do that at a pops concert." And it became a big scandal that we would bring a real piece of music to a pops concert, and the audience went with it. I mean, we thought this was a real, taking pops concerts a major step forward. But
yeah.
Do you recall that, or was it because you wouldn't have been involved in the piece? You might not have known that.
Yeah, I don't remember that. I don't remember that part. I do remember the time when we had the group coming out to play with you, and so I had set it up that we would all wear white tennis shoes, and we all came running out onto the stage. So you told me that was the first time that had been done, but it's no, I don't remember the Lucas Foss piece.
It's an interesting role. Well, brass in an orchestra, and I know this was, well, one of the motivations for Canadian Brass when Gene Watts was, quite eager to get to the front of the stage. He'd been in orchestras for years, and his idea was to be more in charge of your own destiny. Like chamber music, you create your own repertoire choices and everything else. And one of the things that we liked to do, as a matter of fact, was to bring brass players out to the front because, oh gosh, the brass playing is so fine in North America, well, now the world, but brass players were often the strongest section of orchestras would be the brass players, and they're all at the back. So we'd bring them out and play, real music, Wagner and,
Bach Bell Cannon.
Stuff. Yeah, the canon. Yes, indeed. Move over. Yeah. But that was one of the things of yeah, bringing you guys out was really always great fun.
Yeah, that was great. You know, I was going to tell you about the first small 3/4 tuba that you got. Because you were playing on a 641, the original with the maple leaf on it, the little
Yes.
one that's kind of more like the piggy size.
Yep.
And I happened to go over to Schilke's, which was of course on Wabash back then, after a lesson with Mr. Jacobs, just a couple blocks away, and go up to the upstairs, and Mr. Schilke sees me, and by then he knew who I was and that I was a student of Mr. Jacobs. He says, "Arnold's over in his studio." I said, "Yeah, I just finished with him. Take this over to him." So it was the little 3/4 tuba put together, all soldered together, but no braces anyplace. It was all just wired together. So I carried that with no bag or anything over to Mr. Jacobs' studio, and we all played that horn. It was an amazing horn, but it was funny because I got to see that horn probably before you did.
Before I did.
So,
well, Mr. Schilke was quite convinced that tubas were generally inefficient, and that he thought he could get a larger bang for the buck, a smaller instrument with a powerful sound. And he went to work to do exactly that. I think he had a fellow in the back that was working on the tubas, Ron Collier.
Ron Collier, yes.
He spent about a year working on that tuba, and he had it sitting on the desk. We like going into a auto repair shop and you see the transmission sitting on the counter. Well, there's a tuba sitting there, and Ron would be standing back and he'd smoked a cigarette and he'd be thinking, and then he'd go in and make an adjustment, and that was his day. But it would take all day. I mean, he really thought it through. It was a beautiful wrap. Everything about it was really terrific. But that kind of custom handmade instrument kind of thing, it's tough to find these days.
Yes. Yes.
And you're in that, but by the way, and this is important.
Oh.
So Dave Fedderly, the great tuba player, is now also the very successful businessman, entrepreneur. You started the Baltimore Brass Company, BBC. I don't know how you got away with BBC, but
it wasn't me. It just started showing up in social media and things that way.
Nice.
For me, it's always Baltimore Brass Company. It's rare that I'll put BBC.
Okay.
Because I do have a picture of me standing in front of the BBC in England, in front of the sign. So,
nice.
But yeah, I started that, and it's thanks to you actually, and Ed Getson, who has recently passed away.
Oh wait, yes, here's the royalty check you sent me. Thank you. Oh no.
So what happened is you all had that line of boutique instruments for a while, and I started selling them, and that's kind of how Baltimore Brass Company started. And there was one of the service bands wanted to buy something over in Germany, one of our bands, and I said okay, and they said, well, what's the company name? This is like at 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning. This person's, I said, well, it's just my name. No, we can't do that. It's got to be. And so I'm sitting there in my basement. I said, Baltimore Brass Company.
Perfect.
And so for a while, I got a lot of crap about, oh, what kind of toilets do you sell? And, because of the brass company, all this stuff. People don't joke about that so much anymore. But it was because of the Canadian brass line of instruments that I actually got going. And then Gerhard brought Lionel Weston back as Getson being the distributor. And then I ended up with that also. And that really kind of got things going. So I have you to thank for the beginning of Baltimore Brass Company.
Well, as you well know, anybody that asks me about buying a tuba, like I need an instrument for my son or whatever, I have one recommendation.
Thank you.
I give them your number, because one thing is you're really knowledgeable about the instruments. There's no question when you're telling a parent, for example, the confidence to go ahead and buy this instrument, you've got a lot of behind that information. And I've never found you to be a hard sell guy. I mean, you're just the opposite. You're gonna tell tell me all the problems with this horn and all the things you're going to reach with it. You got to be sure. And are you sure you want to do this? Like, and I love that. And I love recommending people to you because they always,
Thank you.
first of all, they're going to get a really genuinely deep understanding of what they're getting involved with, or buying a major piece of equipment.
Mhm.
And also the fact that you're always very fair. It's just been natural to do that. So
Paul Walton said something to me a long time ago, and he said that a particular person wasn't a good businessman because he didn't charge his friends enough, so he had to charge everybody else too much. And so I just tell people, you won't pay the same price for this instrument unless it's like a special person, say an artist, and I get a call from the manufacturer saying we're giving another 10% off of this. Then I just give the 10% to that player too.
mm-hmm.
But they're going to pay, if there's no discounts and like that, they pay the same price. That doesn't matter who they are. And we try to keep it fair that way, and we try to keep prices fair, and never a hard sell. I mean,
That's the old joke. The guy that goes in the hotel and says, I want a special rate on the room. I'm friends with the owner. And the guy says, oh, just a minute. And he goes back and he goes to the owner. He says, there's a guy out here. He says he wants a special price because he's a friend of yours. He says, a friend of mine? Charge him double. My friends want me to succeed.
I'll remember that next time you call me.
Exactly.
So when you were a student at Northwestern, I'm just curious, when you were a student at Northwestern, did you think that sort of the retail business, did you think that would be part of your career? Because, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, but I do, some web design on the side. And when I was growing up, I don't think I ever thought of, having a varied career. I thought I would just be a tuba player and that would be it. Did you think that that would be it? Or did you think that you would sort of have some outside interest that would be part of your career as well?
I've written about this and I've talked about this, about piecing it together.
Uh-huh.
And my hometown was a company town, and it was involved in the steel industry. It was Armco and Republic Steels. It was Reserve Mining Company. And when the steel industry in this country went down, that town went down. And you had all of a sudden a town of 3,000 people with almost no work. And I just realized I did not want all of my eggs in one basket. And so I've never done that. So if you have some teaching, I was always selling an instrument. If I had an instrument and I wanted to buy a new instrument, I'd sell it to get the new instrument. When I was in Boy Scouts, and we had our pancake suppers, one year, the one who was closest to me sold 12 tickets and I sold 120 in a small town. It was just, it was just something I enjoyed doing. And I thought there was room. When I got to Baltimore, there was no really major music store in Baltimore, and that you had a conservatory there with Peabody, and you had the Baltimore Symphony, and there was no real true music store there for repairs or selling instruments or really anything. And so that's kind of where that happened. And I had a son, and I wanted to pay for his education, and it helped. And so that's kind of where it all started. But so I always did stuff in Chicago. If enough money wasn't coming in from teaching or playing, I was out doing carpentry work or working on people's cars when I was in college. So I always had other stuff going on just to make sure there was enough money coming in. So it was more of a necessity than
yeah, like a survival thing,
I like to eat.
Yeah, exactly. That's so fascinating. I think that piece of advice is so important for students because so many, especially nowadays or in the pandemic, what's paying the bills right now? Not tuba playing. It's the things outside that we're doing. And, I've done some web design and various things. And those are the things that are paying my rent right now. And I think it's important for people just to keep an open mind to possibly having enough emotional and mental space to doing other things, because otherwise you never know what's going to happen, like now in the world.
Well, Doug Yo was a teacher. He has a music ed degree from Wheaton College, and he taught school until he got in the Baltimore Symphony, and then he got in the Boston Symphony. A lot of people did different things and then got into the music business. But for me, there's always been many more things going on. I worked for landscaping companies. I've worked painting. I've done boat repair. You name it, I've pretty much done it. Mr. Jacobs played rodeos. I mean, real rodeos. And he also played the Marshall Field style shows on Friday mornings on string bass.
By
So
the way, you've heard you heard the comedian that said he'd make sure to go to 2 rodeos, because the second one you say, "Hey man, this ain't my first rodeo."
oh, jeez.
Where's my cane? Get out of here, Chuck.
Hey, it's a clean joke. What can you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How good can it be? Yeah, no, it's been quite a ride, and I still, I'm still piecing it together. I'm still teaching at University of Maryland. Of course, we'll be virtual this fall. The store is still there. We're living in South Carolina at this point, just over the border from North Carolina. So I'm back and forth. I've got some people asking me if I can come in and do maybe some master classes down in this area now that I'm here, and it's much cheaper because I live down here. So it's just piecing it together, and
Nice.
it's what musicians do. I mean, you've done the same thing, Chuck.
Sure. And it's been fun. I feel like there are a whole group of people we've kind of grown up together. We're in the same era, and it was fun to watch you branch out. And when you started that company, it just seemed kind of seamless. And it's interesting to hear how you did start. And it was seamless. It just was little steps. And I think that's the other thing that people, when you're talking to all your friends and colleagues too, it's little steps.
Oh, absolutely.
You do something, you look back and you say, well, we could never do this now because it's huge. Like you couldn't build your build. You couldn't in one fell swoop do what you did, but you started out modestly and just earnestly put together a nice operation.
Yeah, I was in my house from 1992 until September of 01. I was in my house. I was the company. There were no employees. And then in 2001, I went brick and mortar. But yeah, it has to be slow, especially because we don't have a lot of the training that, I didn't have a business degree. And there's all of these, okay, now I have to start taking credit cards. Well, I don't have brick and mortar. I got to find a company that will, and you reach out to somebody who's got something similar and they say, we'll go with this company, which is what I did. And then all of a sudden you've got this insurance. You have to, okay, now I got to get this license. All right. You go kind of get dragged kicking and screaming, but if you want to stay in business, that's what you do. So that's what I always tell my employees. It needs to grow slowly enough that we can keep the same quality of the way we sell, the way we do repairs. We have to keep the quality up where it has to be. You can get too big where quality suffers, and then the whole company suffers.
Well, how many times have you seen a really great restaurant that you love become so successful they add a second equal dining room, and pretty soon they're out of business?
Yes, exactly.
They lose touch. Yeah, that's sort of a syndrome. Dave, it's really great to meet up with you, and it's nice to put you and Jarrett in touch, because Jarrett's our up and comer here who's kind of following a similar route.
That's what I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really nice to have this conversation.
Yeah.
And I used to have a sister-in-law that actually taught music up in Winnipeg.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A graduate of University of Minnesota.
Wow, I hope she had a good coat.
Yeah, and she had the in-car heater, for the night. So
of course. Block heater.
We had those even in Silver Bay. I can tell you that, with the metal garages.
I remember when I moved there, I was like, what are these plugs sticking out of these cars? I realized pretty quickly.
Yeah, you learned real quickly.
You do.
Well, David, this is fun. It's fun to meet up. We've been bumping into each other at places like the Midwest Band Clinic and places we gravitate towards, but really nice to see you and to hear you. And this was a very nice chat. Thanks, Jarrett. Been great.
Thank you.
Chuck, I want to say one other thing. Because I told Mary Beth at Midwest, you were talking about Toby and the way he played and the clarity and all of that. And the one thing that I've always been so blown away, I'm not trying to kiss up here, is that I don't know anybody in our business that can just float from about C second space to D and E above the staff all night with such ease and accuracy and beautiful sound. It's just, you're the only person that I ever heard do that. And it was something that I was always amazed when I would hear your concerts and things and the recordings. So thank you for that. I mean, that was a real joy to always hear.
And I'm returning the royalty check. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good.
Thanks so much
All
for
righty,
coming.
Take care, guys.
Really great.
You all
Great
take
to see
care.
you.